first, I would like to thank my wonderful Green Talk support team, which consists of Fred Carter, who's here, Kevin Brewer, who's in the green room, Sarah Gabrielle Barron, and also having not arrived quite yet, Nancy Moniz and Jenny Warden and Neera Chowdhury. But also for this particular panel, I would like to thank Evelyn Tanaka, who is going to be support for here, as well as Rory Taylor. So thank you very much in advance. I will hopefully remember to thank you after the session as well. I'd like to remind everybody that, well, first I thanked everybody, but next I'd like to remind everybody that this is a safe space. We are recording and we are live streaming on YouTube. And I want to be very, very careful to protect the safety of our guests because this is an extremely sensitive topic. YouTube, remember, it is open to media and it is open to the general public. So we have Rocket Chat that's going to be available for anybody who is interested in chatting amongst yourselves, the attendees, some of the panelists as well. I believe Fred is going to be putting in the link for this particular discussion into Rocket Chat. The way that this is going to work is there is going to be 4 moderated questions. The point of these questions is supposed to be conversation starters for our guests. Each conversation is going to be about 15 minutes long, and that will take up an hour. And then after that, we're going to open it up to Q&A. In order to ask a question, you can put it into Rocket Chat, and our support team, Rory and Evelyn, will be keeping an eye on Rocket Chat to bring any questions forward here. We also have the Q&A function available here. So if you wanted to type in your question, we will be asking our guests those. And we have the raised hand function if you wanted to ask those questions live. Now, I haven't done a land acknowledgement yet, and the reason for that is because I wanted to tie into an introduction of our guests. I always invite people to, because we're all across Canada, to consider the land that they are on currently. For me, I am on Treaty 13 lands. They're the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I usually like to think about the lessons that I have learned that really resonated with me and how they're applicable to any type of talk or any meeting or session that is about to happen. So for me today, I would like to talk about one of my wonderful teachers. I was so lucky to have been taught for a short period of time by the incomparable, the absolutely amazing elder from Stalo Nation, who unfortunately passed away in about Remembrance Day around that time. And it was very enlightening for me because, first of all, it was the amazing poet Lee Miracle. I can't not name her. She was just so incredible with her storytelling and her poetry. And she would tell me stories about the Stalo Nation, which were unfamiliar to me because I'm not from British Columbia. I have Haudenosaunee teachers, I have Anishinaabe teachers, so I know about Ontario and Indigenous peoples and their history here, but not so much about Stalo Nation and the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia. And she taught me a lot about the differences. So for instance, here we would talk about strawberries, but Stalo Nation, they would talk about salmon berries. We talked about tobacco. She would tell me about cedar and salmon. Even her Sky Woman stories or the stories of creation, even her Thanksgiving address were slightly different, except the meaning was always the same. And it kind of struck me at that point, which is what led me to today, that there are so many differences that we have in sometimes our messaging, except the same issues across the country. And that's the reason why I invited the guests that I did today. all of them have the same federal obstacles, but very different local and provincial challenges. And each has a different story to tell. And that's what I wanted to bring out, that we all share those same issues and those same values and those same principles, but we have different ways of facing them, different ways of combating those obstacles. So the industry, the sex industry for each, was also drastically changed with the pandemic on a federal level, once again, even on a global level. But on the other hand, each province, each municipality dealt with the pandemics, the regulations, any of the, like, for instance, masking or social distancing, dealt with it, or self-isolating. They dealt with it all differently. So that was kind of the story that I wanted to bring forward. How was this brought about? So I'd like to introduce my guests right now. First, we have Alison Clancey, who is the executive director of SWAN Vancouver, which is a support and advocacy group for immigrant and migrant sex workers. She has also extensive experience providing support and advocacy for sex workers, and is a strong supporter of law and policy reform. Next, we have Elene Lamb, who is the founder of Butterfly, a wonderful guest that I've had before. Butterfly is a grassroots advocacy group for Asian and migrant sex workers based in Toronto. And Elene herself has been a supporter and advocate for sex workers since she was 19 years old in Hong Kong. So she has even a global perspective. And my last guest is Mona Peace, who is the co-founder of Answers, Advocacy Normalizing Sex Work Through Education and Resources Society based in Alberta. And Mona is also a great advocate for the sex work industry. She has asked that her video remain off. However, you will be hearing her speak. So without further ado, I would like to begin our first moderated question. I invite the speakers to basically, as I had said, this is a conversation starter. So if you can contribute your thoughts to these questions and then chime in whenever if you have things to add. So the very first question, and it's kind of a basic introduction. Let's start by shedding some light on sex work and the sex industry. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada removed provisions in the criminal code that criminalize sex work, but the Protection of Communities Exploited Persons Act, PCEPA, has essentially made sex work just as prohibited. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, the IRPR, particularly in conjunction with the PCEPA, has made the industry more dangerous for sex workers, particularly racialized sex workers. Will you please speak a little bit on the difference between human trafficking and consensual sex work, and how these particular laws have done the opposite of what they claimed, which is to protect sex workers? Whoever wants to jump in.
Sure, I can get started. Thank you, Alison. I'd just like to acknowledge first by starting by saying that I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Kootenai, Syilx, and Silex peoples in British Columbia. So the first question, very simply, I would say sex work involves consent, whereas human trafficking does not, although it can start out as a consensual relationship or interaction. Unfortunately, right now in Canada and really globally, the trafficking narrative really has been really reduced to a really rudimentary understanding of related issues that hinges on victims, villains, and heroes. And for the most part, it excludes trafficking in other work sectors in Canada, such as agriculture or domestic work, the service industry, and it most certainly also excludes, when talking about the sex industry, male sex workers, gender diverse, non-binary sex workers as well. So Unfortunately, a lot of people, including policymakers in Canada, don't have opportunities like we're having here today to sit down and have a really nuanced discussion about the complexities of the sex trade. And for many, without that understanding, all too often sex work has become conflated with human trafficking, in that any type of involvement in the sex industry whatsoever has been conflated with human trafficking. And this has become very harmful to sex workers in the laws, the legislation, the policies, and the procedures that are enforced. So I understand that a lot of people are compelled to end human trafficking, but without being able to separate the fact from the fiction, more often than not, people are supporting anti-trafficking initiatives that have become really harmful to sex workers. So the second part of the question was how the laws are doing the opposite of what they've claimed, and that is to protect sex workers. So I'll just speak about the experience in BC and in Greater Vancouver, which I know will be very different, well, somewhat different than what Elene will talk about in Toronto and Ontario. But the criminalization and the enforcement and the laws that affect migrant and immigrant sex workers in Greater Vancouver in descending order from the most harmful to the least harmful, I would say is firstly the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which prohibits temporary residents from engaging in the sex trade. So this results in migrant sex workers being arrested, detained, and deported. Secondly, the most harmful are anti-trafficking laws and enforcement, and that has just created so much surveillance, harassment, and these rescue raids that purportedly protect migrant sex workers, but they don't. And in regard to Asian sex workers, which is the majority of the women that we provide services to, anytime there's two Asian women working together, there's these systemic racist assumptions that there's organized crime involved, or that one woman is trafficking another woman. And it just turns out really badly. And then thirdly, I would say here in BC, the next set of laws of this multi-layered criminalization that affects migrant and immigrant sex workers are Canada's prostitution laws. These prostitution laws often act as a gateway for investigations and surveillance. And whether a woman is a victim or not, the type of the law enforcement involvement in the women's lives either end up with the women being incriminated in an anti-trafficking investigation themselves, or being arrested, detained, and deported under the immigration violation. And then fourthly, and I think this differs greatly from Greater Toronto, is that we don't have as much of an issue anymore with municipal policy and bylaw enforcement. And I'll get into the reasons for that a little bit later as to the work that's gone on at the City of Vancouver, but I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you for Alison. And I think that is like just echo is like how we see the law actually is harm for the sex worker, particular migrant sex worker, and also that is like how the conflation of human trafficking and sex work is being used against the sex worker. So, and I think that maybe I can start with what Butterfly. Butterfly is a grassroots organization. We are the community lead organization. So that's why every day we learn something is actually from the ground instead of ideological, that is human trafficking and conflation. What we see a lot of policymaker and also a lot of organization, that particularly the anti-trafficking organization, that they do not really see and work with the people on the ground. And I think that is very important. All the story and all the experience, how the law is harm is actually what we see every day. So, and I think that is I think the law and also the conflation of trafficking is mixed together. And I think some of you may know that how important of this panel, as Alison said, is mostly the sex worker perspective is not being reflected and shared. So that's please, and I'm so glad you come here like online or help to share this video, because I think this is so important. You help the sex worker community voice being heard and particularly know about the harm of the law and the conflation of human trafficking and sex work. And I will start with the law. The law is called protection and prevent exploitation, but this is not true. because sex work has been criminalized, and because particularly influenced by those moralistic ideas, think sex work is bad, sex work is something, the crime, sex work has been, like the gay community has been used by criminal law to target for many, many years. But with the successful of the sex worker movement, more people believe sex work is work. More people believe that the women should, like including the people, different genders, should have right to decide the use of their body. They should have their ownership and decision on their body. They have agency of their body. So we see that actually lesser people to support, to arrest the sex worker, to rape the sex worker. So, but human trafficking gives the opportunity, because by conflating sex work and human trafficking, they say that I am protecting the woman, I am protecting the vulnerable, but it's not true. When you look at the law, the real purpose is not protect the woman. Even now, like last few weeks in Parliament, so many sex workers go to tell the government, say how this law harm the sex worker. They don't care, because the real purpose of the law is eliminate sex worker. So that's why we know that when there are so many sex workers keep telling the policymaker and those like anti-trafficking organization, anti-sex work organization, this law is harmful. They don't care, because they just want to eliminate sex work and bringing that end demand model. And who are the people? They are easy target. We see Asian sex worker, Asian women have been targeted with class, with immigration status, and racism play an important role. As Alison said, why two Asian women come together immediately become organized crime? So this is the long history of the racism against the Asian community, because Asian is a powerful and beautiful community. We always help each other, but no matter family, friendship, that this is something actually our society keep promoting, right? Community support. But when Asians come together, they often see them as organized crime. And with sex work, give them the really good entry point, see like few people. And we see not only by imagination, we see like few people, they work with their partner, they work with their friends, is being charged as of this criminal law. And the assumption of Asian women, they are passive, they are ignorant, they don't have to bring. We have so many meetings, including, I need to name some of the organization. So for example, Defend Dignity is the anti-sex work, they claim they anti-trafficking organization. In the meeting, they said that the Asian woman cannot speak English. That means cannot consent. They're not able to consent. So this is really, really racist. So, but that racism is played with the hate of sex work and come together. What we see, the murder in Atlanta, but this not only happened in Atlanta, but also happened in Canada, that make the sex worker become the target. But because now the law say, I'm trying to protect and rescue the people, and then they draw so many people's support, right? So, and then the conflation of sex work, of human trafficking is not for all the sex worker. We see that how racialized sex worker, migrant, and youth is the trafficking, traffic victim label is being stick on the face, that no matter what their life story, what their voice is being dismissed. And so this is the very powerful way how we see conflation of sex work and trafficking is the ideological conflation, but it's make it to be the very powerful tools to target the sex worker and harm the sex worker, to target the racialized community. And we work with Asian and migrant. We know that many people is struggle. They are exploited in factory, they are exploited in restaurant, but we do not say we criminalize factory. We do not say we criminalize all the people buy banana because we have so many farm is exploit the worker, right? What we see, we need to create the environment to stop this exploitation, and putting the law, particular criminal law, immigration law, is not helpful. And criminal law come with, as you say, the immigration law also prevent any people without permanent resident to work in sex industry. In our real life experience, even they don't even need to use the law. They often, the law enforcement come in to ask, are you sex worker? At the beginning, you say you are not, and then they found more information and force you to admit you are the sex worker. They already can use many other immigration law like misrepresentation to charge you and kick you away, and how it affects the sex worker really make them be more vulnerable. We have workers being charged before she has like the life she can support herself, but because of the criminal charge, all her property being taken away, she lost her home, even her dog did not have place to stay, and then put them in the jail. And those surveillance and this criminal investigation is make the sex worker be more dangerous because they have no way they can protect each other. The community support, when two sex workers work together, they are supporting each other, but they are being criminalized. So that is make the people be target. And thank you that you want to create this safe space to protect the people. But what we see, why we use butterfly, you cannot protect them by holding in your hand. The criminal law cannot protect people. What we need to change is the environment. How we can have this environment without racism, how we have the environment without that homophobia. We need to eliminate the discrimination against sex workers and take away all this oppressive law, including immigration law, bylaw, and criminal law, that the sex worker can live freely. And I think this is a very important thing. We need to know the law design is not protect, the law is designed to harm, and we need to work together and change it. And sex work, is not exploitation. So exploitation happen everywhere, but doesn't mean we need to criminalize that. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Mona with Answers. I was typing in the wrong chat, but what I've noticed looking at the statistics that abolitionist groups use, it's about 0.5, like 0.5% of all sex workers are trafficked. That leaves 99.5% that aren't. And we are being oppressed. The many are being oppressed for the few. And I think what has happened is that there's been this vicious cycle. I'm sure that initially, well, I don't know. I'm not even sure that initially people ever appreciated that sex work is work. The people that are against us, I think that they've always had a bee in their bonnet about sex work. It's not good enough for them, ergo, it's not good enough for anybody. So when they started to crop up, the abolitionists in you know, the 90s, 80s, 90s, they started getting grants, and good for them. Some of it actually was to do with trafficking. But what happened is, as they got more grants and more people interested in their missions, is they started to conflate sex work with sex trafficking. And it sure made their numbers blossom, because it looks like they are protecting maybe 50, 60,000 Canadians across the country. When really the numbers are far fewer. Only of all the people that are actually human trafficked, only 20% are sex trafficked. But that is where the salacious people listen to that. People don't listen so much when you say somebody was brought over from another country and they were put to work in somebody's home and working for pretty much just food, and they're having traveled there. That's always just a sad story, but it's a quick soundbite. Whereas every time you turn on the television and watch some sort of drama, it's always almost always a dead sex worker, and those, they wrap their stories around that. I mean, every part of society has made sex work it's like it's entertainment. It's not, it shouldn't be entertainment for the masses. It shouldn't be beating on heartstrings. It should be treated like every other type of work that there is. We should be given the same rights and the same responsibilities. I mean, we should be treated just about the same as everybody else that works for a living, and we shouldn't feel bad about it. People say, you know, we're sex workers because we're poor and we need the money. Well, I think everybody works because otherwise they would be poor. Doesn't matter what they're doing. It's all those sorts of ridiculous things. But that is my take on the difference between trafficking and conflation. Thank you.
Go ahead, Alison.
Just a quick point. You can ask any sex work organization across Canada if trafficking is a significant issue that they're addressing, and I would say 100% of the organizations would say no, and it's not because we look at the sex work sector through rose-colored glasses. There actually is a lot of violence that happens because of the stigma and the criminalization of sex work in Canada. It's just so frustrating to not be able to have the actual violence that's happening. For example, violent robberies or sexual assault or other types of assault being addressed because law enforcement, policymakers, the general public are turning their head over here and looking for the sex trafficking when the violence that's happening to sex workers right in front of their eyes is not being addressed.
Thank you so much for that. That's there was a lot to unpack from everything that was said. Just this idea that sex workers are basically being pinned with this identity of being a victim and agency taken away. Particularly immigrant, migrant, and Asian sex workers are almost defined as having not even a normal level of intelligence and therefore cannot consent. And basically, and what Mona said about how, it almost looks like we're saving a lot of people, never mind that they don't want to be saved or need to be saved. So it's really, it does put a different spin on what the general public might see when they're hearing the government say we have these laws that protect sex workers when they're not protecting sex workers at all, and that huge number that they're saying that they're protecting, it's not for them. So that was really it's a great start. It's a lot to unpack for the time being. So moving on to our next question, because I think it also ties, every province is different, from the provincial regulations to the municipal bylaws. Ontario, and Elene and I had talked about this, has Bill 251, which has proven to be extremely marginalizing to sex workers, while Edmonton's adult entertainment bylaws seem progressive and supportive. Will you please tell us a little bit more about sex work, particularly in your province, and how local, provincial, and federal laws, we just did discuss a little bit on federal laws, have defined the industry, particularly in your area?
Oh, I'd like to go first. Edmonton has been very progressive, and I think part of the reason is that some of the advocates that are even currently doing what they can to be supportive, they started petitioning the city of Edmonton back in 1995. There was going to be a change in the bylaws, and initially there was some legislation that was drafted, and it even went to second reading. And that's when some sex workers got wind of it and stopped the third reading. It would have changed a lot of the way that Edmonton sex workers would have had to work, especially those that wanted their independence. They were going to take independence capabilities away from the sex workers. They would have had to work for agencies or own agencies, and that was the only two choices. It took 4.5 years of lobbying the municipality, but that gave the city of Edmonton's council a lot of opportunity to meet with us in subcommittee meetings, to listen to our discussions with mass media, to go to town hall meetings, to go to city hall meetings. They got to kind of know all of us. And when they started to acknowledge that we were speaking our truths, they also stopped legislating against us because they realized that they were heading in the wrong direction. That initial approach to actually talk to sex workers, to actually bring the stakeholders, the main stakeholders, to the table has continued. And so there's been a lot of progress in Edmonton, to the point of today, we are, most of us, licensed willingly. We have to take a mandatory course. It's a one-time thing, but it teaches us our rights, our responsibilities, the legislation that's against us, so we understand it. And we also have to have security clearances, and we get licensed, and none of this costs us any real amount of money. Takes a little bit of time, but those of us that are licensed are free to continue to work, hopefully in relative safely. There has been a strong push from the city to have body rub centers. We probably have 35 or 40 of them around the city. They're rather innocuous. Most people would drive right by them and not even appreciate that there is one that they've whizzed by. And yes, it's behind closed doors, but it's always with another person. The buddy system's been strong. Nobody's dying in these places. In the whole time that they've had a buddy system for body rubs, very little has gone sideways, and certainly there have been no murders, which we can't say for people who aren't licensed and aren't well apprised and take risks because they really don't know other avenues. We've had 2 serial killers that have been convicted here. We did not have the horrors that Vancouver had in the multitudes, but we've had our fair share. I think there's probably 35 women that have been murdered here in the past as many years, less than that. And many go missing in and around our area. And so Edmonton has been focusing on our health and our welfare. And by us going through those little hoops that they want us to jump through so that we understand what the regulations are and what our responsibilities to them are, they in turn allow us to work freely and protected. And that is something we'd love to see in one fashion or another across Canada, because there's a lot of municipalities that are strong in, well, their council comes from often ex-police members. Well, now you've got a different focus because they're all about the law, whereas Edmonton is more progressive, and so they're all about what can we do to make things better for everybody, rather than just worrying about bad laws that need to be enforced. So we've really come a long way, and I hope that, you know, anybody that's a councilman across Canada that hasn't taken the time to bring sex workers to the table, that is the number one first step. Thank you.
I can speak about the municipal, at the municipal and provincial level here in Vancouver and BC. So I feel that the City of Vancouver has the most progressive sex work policy in the country. And Mona mentioned this when she spoke, but that unfortunately had to come about as a result of a serial killer who preyed on sex workers with impunity in the 1980s and 1990s. So Vancouver as a municipality had no choice but to examine its policies and practices and bylaws to make sure that there wasn't municipal policy contributing to an environment that pushed women into the darkest industrial corners of the city. So right now, the City of Vancouver has 2 sex work social planners, full-time positions, and they ensure that there's a sex work lens on all policy decisions at the City of Vancouver, including, for example, urban planning and property development, to make sure that the decisions that are made are not harming sex workers in any way. The City of Vancouver also has guidelines for all city staff, and it makes sure that any city staff interacting or serving sex workers are respectful. They use evidence-based approaches, and their work doesn't allow for any personal moral beliefs and values about the sex industry. The City of Vancouver staff also regularly undergo sex work training. At the provincial level, it's very different than what we see in BC. And I won't speak about laws and policies, but I'll speak about funding. So the last two provincial budget recommendations acknowledge that there needed to be funding for sex work services, not solely for exiting, for encouraging people to get out of the sex work, and not for human trafficking. So there's significant funding to organizations in the province of BC to support sex worker safety. And right now as well, BC is just about to create Canada's first provincial bad date reporting system. So that is a system that sex workers are leading and creating. It has to be created outside of the entire criminal justice system itself, which has been woefully inadequate in meeting sex workers' needs. So we're hoping in the next few years that the province of BC will fund the operations of that provincial system once it's created. And here's just a really good example of what can be done when sex worker-led initiatives are funded and given predominance, because in other provinces, such as in Ontario, there's such a massive, colossal funding towards human trafficking organizations. But sex workers in BC are saying, we need our own bad date reporting system. We report to each other, we report to outreach workers, and then we take the safety precautions that are required to keep sex workers safe and well.
Yeah, thank you both, Mona and Alison. So, and I think that we talk about the criminal law, immigration law, but we call this causeway web because like catching sex worker is also include the provincial law and also the municipal law, and that they make all the sex worker, no matter what type of work or like what kind of immigration status, you still can be targeted by different type of law. And thank you for Mona sharing the experience of lobbying the bylaw, so that we also have done a lot of work, and then we have faced extremely racism, and also face extremely like the anti-sex work sentiment in the process to make how sex worker and Asian massage parlor worker keep being excluded in those consultations. So again, with the lobbying of anti-trafficking organization, and in 2012, Canadian Women Foundation, Government House, and many different kind of anti-trafficking organization, they get a lot of anti-trafficking funding. They tell City of Toronto, oh, there is a lot of trafficking. But why they get this information is just by the conflation of sex work of trafficking, because Asian massage parlor is being seen as associated with sex work, and then they assume that there is a lot of trafficking. That is pushing city to have like more repressive law and enforcement. And what happened is the law enforcement is being told that they need to do something against particular Asian massage parlor because they are being seen as problem. What we see the consequence is the law enforcement will go in the sex worker place, ask them to take off the clothes. If they have some sexy underwear, they will assume they are the sex worker, give them the ticket. And sometimes they will use different like minor thing, like there is a tiny crash of the massage bed and keep like charging the people. Some of the sex worker being a massage parlor worker being investigated 5 times a day. And also that when we look at the statistic, 25% of law enforcement, of by law enforcement investigation is only target on the holistic center, that is the Asian massage parlor worker working. So you see the level of like surveillance, and as a result there is a lot of like ticketing, and also sometimes they also work with CBSA, so that is also breaching the access withdrawal policy of City of Toronto, but also make the sex worker being arrested. So, and then it's not end. And again, 2018, those anti-trafficking organizations is like Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking. They got $40 million. When our government say no funding for environmental work, no funding for housing, no funding for childcare education, they give this $40 million to this organization. And one of the things, they run the hotline. But we know that there is the public safety, give the money to the hotline, and they collect the data also for the government. And also they also support them. They do a lot of advocacy work, including pushing City of Toronto need to do something. And it's need to change the bylaw. Now in City of Toronto, around like 400 holistic center, people offer the service is 90% with 2,000 Asian workers. But in 2018, they have the proposal need to remove the license. Why? Because they have a report say there is trafficking. Again, why they have this evidence? There's no evidence, but they believe there is trafficking. And in the meeting, we have the first meeting, we have 20 workers went to the city hall, and the city staff say, no interpretation. And when we do interpretation, they ask us to lower our voice and sit in the corner. And at the end, the city staff say, it's meaningless even you have 100 people come here. And at the end, we have 300 workers and allies went to City Hall, say, I am not traffic victim. It is my work. But their voice is not still being listened. So the bylaw review is still going on. But this is very important. We see how racism the worker face every day, but also in this policy making process. I was being called Oriental by a city councillor in a meeting. The racialized people being asked what is world traveler, when the worker keeps saying they are not traffic victim, they are still being framed as traffic victim. And then like some of the white saver that they have a lot of funding, just get paid to go to the meeting. They are very influential. What we see, they are not only do deputation in this meeting, they already lobby other policymaker before that. And this is only one example. For example, last year, the Newmarket had the same thing. York Region had the same thing. And then how they really have very clear message, I need to get rid of sex worker. And if Asian worker, if you can't work, doesn't matter. We have the senior home that you can come to work to serve our people. You see how this big, giant anti-trafficking organization work with politicians become the anti-trafficking industry. They earn so much money, but at the same time, they maintain the racism, and also they keep asking for the licensing process. People need to have the permanent resident or have the work permit. And that is, again, exclude the migrant, exclude the racialized, and then how the anti-sex worker policy come with the anti-sex work policy. So that's why I know in this platform, a lot of people concerned about racism, and there is a lot of campaign about anti-Asian racism, but what we see that sex workers should not left behind, like the Atlanta shooting last year, it's very clear the murder is not only killing people because they're Asian, they're also killing them because they are associated with sex. It's because the homophobia, because of the hate of sex work. But what we see how the thing come together, become the powerful. We see so many cities, for example, York Region, over 80% of Asian massage parlor was being shut down in the last few years. And the targeting over policing still continues. And for the Ontario bill, so is, as I said, there is so many different levels because Ontario being framed as the trafficking hub, so there's a lot of funding. When again, right, Ontario no funding for childcare, no funding for housing, $300 million for anti-trafficking. What we trace the funding go to the anti-sex work organization. They are not only anti-trafficking organization, many of them is tied with religion group, have that moralistic idea or having the mission to end sex work. And also many funding go to police. But what we see, for example, last year, even during the pandemic, the law enforcement come in the place of the worker. They have the warrant because they can use the criminal power. They open the door, and when the sex worker did not wearing any clothes, she was being handcuffed, and she was asked, "Is anyone take your money? Is anyone control you? I come to protect you. Are you safe?" And she said, "Before you came, I was safe," and all her money, phone, tablet being taken away. But then now what Ontario government say, oh, some police is bad, we bring in social worker. What happened is after the police talked to her, the social worker come to give her a very shitty phones, right? It's again, this all funding. But when we really have people, they experience violence, what happened when they call the police, or sometimes many of workers don't call the police, the neighbor may call the police and they get arrested, right? But what we see, this anti-trafficking funding is lead to huge surveillance, but because of the level of funding and anti-trafficking work being seen as the organized crime, the level of surveillance and investigation, not only themselves, but also their friends and family. And we see more and more people being harassed. Sometimes the law enforcement come in, take the picture, of their ID. And if the people have precarious immigration status, they are being taken away or arrested and detained and deported. And we see the NGO also is a very like party, get a lot of funding and work with the police and continues to support them. And so as Alison said, instead, like sex worker, or even we see some legal clinic really want to do some work to end human trafficking, they do not get any funding. And Bill 251, we are extremely disappointed with the anti-policing system. A movement like Black Lives Matter, Defund Police movement. We thought that we will have more people to support because the bill is crazy. They use the term human trafficking, and therefore got so much support when like he was being criticized by so many policy. And the law is giving the law enforcement the power, enter any place, talk to anyone, take any document anytime. If you don't talk to the law enforcement, you will get fined. How Canada can accept this bill, but this bill got passed. Even those political parties, some anti-policing organizations still do not speak anything against this bill because they don't want to see as not supporting anti-trafficking work. Again, this is nothing about trafficking. This is about increase the power of police. This is about the racial profiling, surveillance. Is nothing about the care and safety of the worker. And the other piece is Butterfly do not work a lot of youth sex worker, but we also see this bill, how it's harmful because youth above 17 in Ontario, you need to get the consent in order to offer service to them. But this bill, actually, they say protection, they have the power to keep the youth for 24 hours. But this is not keeping, this is detention, right? And then we see so many youth is being put in the childcare system. We know how harmful is the childcare system, but we know who are the people. Of course, it's LGBT community, racialized people. They are being targeted. And of course, more power, the hotel need to share all the information. Again, this is also it's not only harmful for sex workers, but also racialized people, how this can be other platform of racial profiling. So there's a lot of harm. So that's why here we really call for you and really help us to spread the message. Sex work is not trafficking, and all this policy is so harmful. And you also need to look at which are the organizations advocate for this policy, whether they are advocate for the woman and worker and people get more power, resources, or they give more power to police and law enforcement. And whether this is the measure, create a space, the worker can protect themselves or actually put them in danger. So it's very important. Thank you.
And Alison, you had something to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I just recognize, everything that Elene is talking about, it may be very new to people who are unfamiliar with this conversation, and it's a very complex cycle to understand the harms of the anti-trafficking rescue industry, like how Elene has named, the government, anti-trafficking organizations, faith-based organization, law enforcement agencies, and how their work is based on unsubstantiated claims and non-evidence-based statistics, and then it leads to the funding, and then that leads to the laws and the enforcement. It's a very complex story, but I would just like to invite the listeners today. SWAN has a 6-minute video that is very succinct and concise, and it just explains this complexity which we've been talking about today, to just make it more accessible to people who aren't as familiar with the conversations that we're having today. That's on our website, and I think it's also been shared in the resources along with this chat today as well.
Yeah, I think that it was posted into the Rocket chat, but if someone can post it into this chat, into the Zoom chat, that would be great. Thank you so much. That was, I have things to add, but it's been such a great conversation. We've taken up a lot of time. I want to come back to this if we have time though, but let's move on to our next question for now. COVID-19, that was sex work and COVID-19 was the title of this session. COVID-19 undoubtedly had a major impact on the sex industry. And this is a series of questions. What was it like in the beginning, and how did the industry manage to pivot? how was your particular province's vaccination rates, positivity rates, and COVID mandates? How did that play a role in shaping the industry? And how has it differed from sex work in other provinces with different rates and regulations? And have you seen the industry evolve in ways that you think will change the sex industry moving forward, not just beyond the pandemic?
Well, in Edmonton, it was kind of nice because so many of us are already licensed. If you're licensed, you know you've got to do your taxes. And I think we're just a little bit ahead of the game with a lot of people. We were able to take advantage of CRB and CRB and actually not work. Just like a lot of other people that were, you know, self-employed businesses. So that did help a lot of people get through the worst parts of COVID. But I'll tell you, I mean, it's a very intimate thing that we do, and it was tricky navigating when businesses were reopening. There was a lot of fear, and a lot of people migrated to online sex work, chats, things like that, porn, anything that kept them from having direct contact. So that was our experience here in Edmonton.
I would say in Greater Vancouver, what we saw was that the exclusion and from systems like such as the health system, social service system, those exclusions and barriers were exacerbated by COVID-19. So here is where you really saw the impacts of stigma and criminalization. So the women that we support, of course, did not have access to government financial support. So SWAN mobilized and was able to raise and distribute over $50,000. And for example, when I talk about health barriers were exacerbated by COVID-19, there was very little access to vaccine clinics as well. So SWAN had to host 2 community vaccines clinics. So it was more of the same. It was exclusion for immigrant and migrant sex workers to the resources and supports that are available to other residents of Canada. And so that's, I think it's just where we had to step up and fill in those gaps.
Yeah, and I think that is like pandemic is really reflect the crack of the social system. Those who are excluded continues to be excluded, right? Because sex work is being criminalized. Many people is not able to get served because they are afraid that any like kind of tax reporting may lead to criminal investigation. So, and for the migrant, even they have been working here, but because they have precarious immigration status, they are also being excluded. And so for those, they have ID, and some people may run massage parlor because of the language barrier. Even CRA is very racist, so people call that and then they said, you can't speak English, I do not give you your password, I do not believe you can navigate your internet without English speaking. And there is so many level make the worker being like exclude from income support. So Butterfly also do a lot of fundraising. And what we see also the power of community, how they support each other, how sex workers share information with each other. And then I share the report in our textbook. Why we have this report is because we really want to know what happened to the community. In 1 week, we have received 500 calls, but the worker also help us to share the information, and so that also develop different way to navigate, so including or lobby the federal government to have specific funding for sex worker, and also like how to work with other community organizations like Friends of China, Maggie's, and run the vaccine clinic ourselves, right? So, and also how to navigate about those vaccine record and ID. But at the same time, sex work, the targeting never stops. As I said, the anti-trafficking investigation continues, and the emergency order again is being used at the tools of the law enforcement continues target in massage parlor. For example, one worker, during the lockdown, she stayed in the massage parlor because she got sick. She afraid that she will get infected to her like old parents, because like we know that how this like seriously affect old people, and then she stayed there. She received 5 tickets. The law enforcement keep coming again and give her the ticket, and even she do not do any business. She just want to isolate herself. Even the law do not say you cannot stay there, but she still target. And we have 10 massage parlor being ticketed in one day because there is like very complicated policy, right? That people, they just find different way that people do not comply with the policy, including the safety planning is not detailed enough, and there is also the language barrier. But what we see is like how the racial profiling and anti-sex work, anti-massage parlor mandate is being used by law enforcement. Any kind of this law is being used to target sex workers. And I think go back is what we really see the crisis, not only how the sex worker being oppressed, but we also see how we resist together. And I think this is also very important, that how we can support the community instead of having more heavy regulation, but how to provide the resources, information, and facilitate those support. And that's why we know that here have people from different like sector, you're activists, and then we really hope that we have collaboration with you in the future, because in the pandemic we see how different community work together to support the community, including provide food, provide information, and even sometimes it's writing, and also that like and it's also give our opportunity to do more organizing during pandemic. We also support the worker to learn about like how to have an online meeting, that we never stop our organizing and then keep advocate to change the working condition and improving the right and also the working environment. But I think it's just very important, no matter what kind of support, how we really see that support the worker can the community can speak out, the community can do the thing to support each other. And I think this is very important.
I've heard a lot so far about so licensing, buddy system, all of this is proving to be very helpful, particularly in the COVID environment. And then you've got this environment, and then I've heard whorephobia, racism, and all of a sudden you've got buddy system, and then you've got organized crime. And I'm just thinking, and you're articulating it very, very well, that it's not meshing. I don't get it. Like, why is it that it's not understood that the buddy system works? That's what's protection, or licensing is helping us get through the pandemic. And yet, as Elene was saying, all of a sudden you've got these crackdowns, and massage parlors, another reason. COVID is another reason to crack down on massage parlors. Add to that also the racism, add to that also the whorephobia, like this hate of sex industry. And it seems to me that there's a disconnect. Like, there is clearly a disconnect. There's this one idea of we have to protect them, we have to save everybody, and then this clearly the system that works for licensing and buddies, and it's not like the sex work industry doesn't know what they're doing. So, Elene?
And I think when we talk about licensing, we need to be careful, because many business, the licensing is trying to protect the customer safety and facilitate the business. But for many licensing of sex work, it's trying to prohibit the sex work and make sex work more underground. Of course, different city may have.
Well, every city has to talk to the sex work.
Yes,
They have to. It worked in Edmonton. There's reasons why it worked here. It has to be done from the ground up, and it has to be, the municipalities have to talk to sex workers to see what fits everybody. And so, no, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Edmonton's licensing program would work for every municipality, but what would work is what we did. And that was to come to the table and we talked. And it's just, without it, there's nothing. You got to talk.
Yeah. Thank you for Mona, but I just use Toronto as the example. If you
I understand that.
Yeah. So, and I think that when you say this is not consistent, this is very consistent. Some particularly politician and group they are using whatever way they can use, no matter call them criminal, organized crime, or calling them traffic victim, or use safety, whatever reason, just want to target the sex worker, particularly Asian migrant, and eliminate them. And I think this is something very consistent in the way how they keep using, no matter immigration law, criminal law, or bylaw, to do it. And as Mona say, how is so important is every consultation policy need to come from the ground, come from the community. For example, City of Toronto, they do not allow massage parlor to lock the door. So even they want to protect the safety, and we see how the murder actually can come into to kill the people. And why? Because they design the bylaw is the way how they can do the investigation, how they can charge the people, instead of coming from the idea that how the workers should work safely. And I think that is a very different model, as Mona said, how the people really have the policy thinking, the model support, and people can work more safely, happily, instead of like what we see many legal framework and of sex work is trying to control and punish and eliminate sex worker. And what we see many Asian and migrant sex workers is being excluded in many this kind of policies specifically. But thank you so much. And I think that is so important. And Butterfly also have done different report. We have different campaign, include the 8 call of justice. We really want you to sign to support the full decriminalization of sex work, to end the racism. And so we also have different resources. Please read and help us to share the message. And Alison said, like, there is very complicated issue, but we really hope that all of you will listen to us and help us to pass the message and be the allies in your city with the sex worker group, and let you know, as Mona said, what they want, what they need, what is the best thing they want you to be the ally and work together and make the change. And I think that's, instead of going like million dollar for harming the sex worker, how the resources, our people, you know, everything should go to the work, including housing, including like income support. That's all important thing instead of like policing.
Thank you. Mona has to leave in a couple of minutes. So thank you very much, Mona. I loved your perspective. It was really interesting to hear about Edmonton and Alberta. Did you have anything to add before you left? We are going to continue on with the conversation with Alison and Elene, but did you have anything?
Nope. I really appreciate everything. Thank you. I'm glad you're getting the word out for us, and thank you. Thank you
so much, Mona. It was so important to have your voice, and we are so fortunate that you were able to make the time for us. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. So we'll move on to our last moderated question before we open the floor. We've already had the discussion in what ways the laws such as PCEPA and IRPR target racialized sex workers. We also know that since the beginning of the pandemic specifically, anti-Asian hate and violence have increased dramatically. According to Project 1907, per capita, and this might be surprising for our attendees, Canada has more reported incidents than the United States by 100%. And British Columbia has the most reported incidents per capita of any North American province, state, or territory, and Ontario ranks 4th. How has COVID influenced the sex industry for racialized and marginalized workers, even though we already knew they were targets? And in what ways can consensual sex work and marginalized sex workers be supported by both locally and federally?
Yeah, again, I'll go back to Vancouver's example. So Vancouver, there were statistics that Vancouver experienced a 717% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. And so just going back to the point that I made before, migrant and immigrant sex workers in Greater Vancouver are already living in so much isolation, living with so much stigma. So the anti-Asian racism that was a result of COVID just really exacerbated that to such a greater extent. And so when it comes to what can be done, I think just reiterating points that have already been made, ensure that sex workers are at the table making the policies and laws and practices and legislation that affect them the most, for the general public to learn the difference between trafficking and sex work that has been repeated so many times. We really need evidence-based law, policy, and practice in Canada. Elene talked about earlier the recent Justice and Human Rights Committee hearings on the review of Canada's prostitution laws. Both Elene and I testified at that committee hearing, and my takeaway from that was an absolute national embarrassment, that the amount of trafficking, fear-mongering, and hysteria was uncritically consumed. I would have expected that the members of parliament who were on that committee would have come prepared and educated on the difference between human trafficking and sex work, and they were not. So the trafficking hysteria was given a national platform that was just uncritically consumed, and it was a national embarrassment. And again, I mean, I just can't say it enough, just to listen to sex workers. Sex workers are not a population of victims. We need to differentiate when sex workers are victims of crime versus victims as just from their being. So just really making sure that sex workers have the seat at the table when policy and legislation is being created.
Yes, thank you. So, and I think that when we talk about anti-Asian racism, we need to know there is like different type of racism, right? So no matter the discrimination people face every day, so like no matter verbal or physical attack, so that is like one type of like racism people experience. Of course, that is like what we see after pandemic, no matter the harassment of the people who are in business on the streets, even they are on the bus, even being yelled at by the bus driver at the beginning when people trying to wear the mask, they was being denied to go to the hospital or even grocery store, and that kind of harassment and attack has been increased. So, but that is not only one after pandemic, right? But it's always people facing. And I think the other big piece of racism is the systematic racism. And particularly we see how the intersectionality is important when we talk about anti-Asian racism, how those people do not speak English, have precarious immigration status, and poor, and particularly sex worker. What we see, they are often being targeted because they know that they can target them. So that's why, as Alison said, we see so many robbery, we see so many sexual assault against the sex worker and massage parlor, because they know the system is not protect them. They know that all the supportive measure is being criminalized, that they are not able to seek help. So that is that kind of violence has increased. And the other piece is the systematic racism. That's what I mentioned, right? So for example, it's ridiculous. The city of Toronto, they have a consultation on anti-Asian racism, but so basic, even no interpretation is arranged, right? So that is like, again, that like no support for marginalized people to support. And then how they continue being excluded in the decision-making process, and also the daily life contribution of like even the knowledge, how the thing affect them, right? So, and I don't know in other city, but in Canada, when racialized people, non-English speaking people do deportation in City Hall, they don't have extra time, they don't have interpretation. That is all the systematic barrier. And during pandemic, like I use City of Toronto as example, they keep promoting access without fear policy of service provider. They ask the service provider, you should not check the ID. But City of Toronto are the people that if you want to work in massage parlor, the first thing they ask you is the work permit. Themselves is violate that policy. But again, we look at who are the people impact. Again, is the racialized people, non-English people. So that and also the racial profiling by law enforcement. So that when we talk about anti-Asian racism, we see how many racialized people being ticketed and in the park, in public space. So that is, I think this is also very important to look at, not only the incident that is very important, but then how to also understand the systematic racism in policy making process in the everyday life, how they are racial profile and how they are excluded by, I just used the example of the income support and all that kind of thing. And I would like to talk more about what people can do, because many people think that, oh, this is anti-Asian racism, anti-Asian hate. And we hear some group, they call for increase of more law and policing. Again, who are the major source of violence for racialized people? And police, right? So, and particularly those poor, have precarious immigration status, law enforcement, again, is the tools to target them. So that instead of to promote more hate crime or promote like more policing, we were so afraid when some organization calling for more police patrol, that what we see actually is more people being targeted by the law enforcement, including undocumented people or people with mental health, people use drugs, or people they are poor, right? So that how we can develop like different community approach, transformative approach to address the issue that what we are facing in anti-Asian racism 2020 rally in Toronto. Our workers said the police do not protect us. We need to protect ourselves. The we is not only sex worker, massage parlor worker, we as the community, how we can develop different measure in innovative, for example, Friends of Chinatown in Toronto also like using some community support they have. And I think this is very important, the way we think. This is same as human trafficking issue. This is same as domestic violence issue. We have so many members, they experience domestic violence, but they are the person being arrested and charged, and anti-trafficking investigation and the anti-sex work law they claim to protect sex worker is not. So that's why we also calling for the people really learning about the harm of causeway approach to particular racialized people, marginalized people, migrant, LGBT community, indigenous community, that develop the alternative, and how to support, like be the strong allies, as I said, that let the sex worker lead you what to do. And of course, like many sex workers already speak out how this law is harmful. As Alison said, we do not only speak in the parliament, but we also has launched a new constitution challenge. When we went to City Hall, to be honest, 300 workers went there. The city still don't want to listen to us, but we have also other strong allies come with us. This doesn't mean the workers' voice is not important, but we know how racism make our voice not being heard, that how important we need to have the allies. We know that some people in York region, I don't know who is willing to work with us, because the York Region Police continues to racial profile the people and given tickets for so many workers and put them in danger. And then how we can work together, share your resources, your power, your network to make us stronger. And I think what we call for is building the solidarity of different movements. Migrant sex worker movement is not only migrant sex worker movement. We are part of the racial justice movement. We are part of the gender-based and gender-based violence movement. Why we are part of the social justice movement? Then how you also see when you talk about housing issue, that how you include sex worker in your movement, and how you be not only ally, but you see sex worker issue is your own issue, that how you let the sex worker take the leadership, that how to include the sex worker concern in your own agenda, and then how you can be like support what sex worker is asking for. And I think that is very important. And thank you for creating this amazing opportunity we can share. And we hope that feel free to contact us. And I think having some small sharing in your field, you know, in your network, or like if you're a specific group, that we can have like more dialogue. We really hope that we can have this strong solidarity across the movement, that including with Black Lives Matter, Indigenous justice, migrant, and all these different movement, LGBT movement to come, because we have been put as the enemy against each other. That how we should come together to build a stronger power to resist the real oppression.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And you know that I'm happy to support you here in York Region. Elaine and I are practically neighbors, so I'm happy to be here for you. Alison, did you have anything else to add before we open the floor to questions?
No.
Okay, so among our attendees, Cheryl has had her hand up for a while. I hope she's still here. Cheryl, I'm going to give you permission to speak. You should be able to unmute. In the meantime, if anybody wants to ask any questions in the Q&A, and I will. Hello? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Just with my daughter and my mom. I just wanted to say thank you for hosting the session. And I had just wanted to make a few comments regarding, I've worked for many years. My name is Cheryl Matthew, Dr. Cheryl Matthew. I'm from the Seat First Nation, from the Secwepemc Nation in British Columbia. And I've been in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish for on and off for 25 years. So for many years, we've done a lot of work. I'm also the executive director of Protect Our Indigenous Sisters Society. So I wanted to make a couple comments about how important it is. I understand and I agree with what's been said regarding sex trafficking versus sex work. And just wanted to say in the domestic sex trafficking context, it's also important to consider how Indigenous women are actually trafficked, and this often happens with gangs. So not only is our population extremely vulnerable, I think the other issue that's been addressed a bit is about young people. So in terms of balancing those interests between protection and safety of our vulnerable populations, et cetera, because what happens in our communities is young girls are recruited from elementary school and often just kidnapped right out of the elementary school, or recruited through high school through, and then what happens is gang members get them caught on an addiction, and then they are moved from Vancouver to Edmonton to end up in Toronto, across Canada. And I think this is a challenge. So I think part of it is also recognizing that one thing that would help is the legalization, and I'm really interested to hear more about this in Edmonton, is the legalization of sex work. For one thing, to make the situation more safe for women, but then also to have increased protections like taxation for health, and then more safety for young people who are actually recruited. And even if they're not necessarily sex trafficked, but they are lured in because they are in poverty. And to remember that this is also a transgender and two-spirit LGBTQIA+ issue, and that we have many of our two-spirited people who are also vulnerable. And they are even more vulnerable because they're often ostracized in communities and then sort of left vulnerable without contact, without friends or family. So I just wanted to make those few points, and I wanted to applaud this session. I am so pleased to see this and just really inspired to hear different contexts from different cities across Canada. I spent a number of years in Ottawa working on actual domestic sex trafficking with Indigenous Services Canada. So I'm really glad to see that we are sort of as a party expanding and looking at all kinds of different social issues beyond our commitment to the environment. So Cook's Gem, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Cheryl. Unfortunately, Mona can't answer for Edmonton because she had to leave, but Elaine, Alison, do you think you can answer to the rest of it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Cheryl, for bringing forth those perspectives. And I just wanted to point out, that my critique of the anti-trafficking rescue industry is not in any way meant to diminish the seriousness of the trafficking of youth or violence perpetrated against Indigenous women or girls, or that trafficking. However, Elene talked about this before. What I do see that I find concerning with approaches to addressing the violence against Indigenous women who are trafficking, it's those carceral approaches that are used, and encouraging the involvement of law enforcement in the lives of Indigenous women, which I find really concerning given the systemic racism of law enforcement against Indigenous women and girls. Just the second point, just to clarify that sex workers advocate for decriminalization, not legalization. Sometimes those terms are understood as being one and the same, or the terms are being used interchangeably. So I just wanted to clarify that decriminalization, it just removes the criminal penalties against sex work, and it would rely instead on a criminal code sections such as assault or extortion or sexual assault. So it doesn't become a free-for-all. In the sex industry, there are still more than enough robust laws in the criminal code to address every conceivable violent act that could be perpetrated against sex workers. So what decriminalization would mean is that it would open up avenues to occupational health and safety and labor protections, which through criminalization, sex workers don't have right now.
And thank you. So I think what you share is exactly why we want the law and policy change, is because actually the law and policy create the vulnerability of the sex worker, how they are being stigmatized, how they are being excluded, and how people may take advantage of the criminalization and put them in danger. So for example you put is there is already criminal law that can arrest the people that they can, if they kidnap someone. So myself do not think criminal law is the best way to address, but if you really want to look at criminal law, that there is there. But why the people do not think is useful and helpful, and why does the people is run away from the childcare protection? And then why the people do not have income? So actually, because we have very limited time, so this Canadian sex work law reform, so they have talked about how the criminalization affect the sex worker, and particularly there is a youth piece. It's like when the criminalization actually put people in more dangerous, marginalized that, and what kind of thing we can do actually can empower, and then and also give more resources for the youth that they can use the legal system that already put there, and also how they are being be, as you say, the factor like including housing, including income, that make the people be more vulnerable. And I think the conflation of human trafficking, what we talked about, the complexity, because when we have the term human trafficking, we don't know what we are talking about. Are you talking kidnapping? Are you talking about workplace exploitation, the boss do not pay, or you talk about the sexual assault that is like someone being forced to have sex with other people, right? But with the term human trafficking becomes so powerful, what we see is so many Indigenous women being charged of trafficking other sex workers by working together, and many of those people are also the young people, and I think that is the reality, how this law is being used to charge against the worker. In the deputation of the government, the police say, yes, I arrest someone by helping her, right? There is many ways you can provide the support without arresting someone, right? So, and I think that I really thank you for your sharing, and I think this is very important in the concern, and in the Constitution challenge, there is also Indigenous sex worker talk about how this law actually prevent them to protect themselves, actually it's increased the vulnerability, and sex workers are the strongest advocate to stop any kind of violence in the community, including rape, assault, sexual assault, and trafficking is one of the things, and also the labor exploitation. And we would love to have like more dialogue, and also we know that like what happened, we see like there is a lot of diversity, same as when before Butterfly was born, we hear that the Asian group say the sex worker is not, no Asian be the sex worker, you know, like sex work is not work. But we also said that's why we keep bringing the intersectionality, that how even among the community ourselves, we keep educate each other, and then how people with different experience, they learn about. And because Butterfly is so working closely with other sex worker organization, we also met a lot of like a sex worker from different background. In general, you are very rare to say they want more police and more criminal law in their life, right? They really care about the safety. They really care about, they don't want to be exploited. They don't want other sex workers being exploited, and how can come together with like the non-carceral solution that actually to give back the power. And there is a slogan called rights, not rescue. So that when the people can access the right, they don't need other people to rescue. And when there is the right, then the people can actually exercise the rights, and including rights, including resources, including like right to health, right to safety, including like the labor protection and any kind of protection, and take away those criminal law. When we talk about criminalization, it's not only the criminal law, but what all different level of law we just mentioned. And I think this is really important. We have this dialogue, and important. We also see many organizations, they have been support the criminalization of sex work. They have changed the position, or they are discussing to changing the position, because they really see this law is used to arrest the sex worker, not protect the sex worker. They used to impose those moralistic ideas to eliminate sex worker instead of upholding the sex worker rights. Thank you.
So we're coming up to the end, but I'm interested in hearing some final thoughts, simply because the intersectionality was this was the first time I heard that word pop up, except we've been talking about this entire time. We just haven't mentioned intersectionality, because we're talking about people who are sexualized, people who are racialized, and we did talk about language barriers. This is very colonial as well. Something that, other than language barriers, we did talk about last time Elene and I had this conversation, education, privilege, because the laws favor the privileged. So there's a lot of intersectionality going on here. So I don't know if you want to take that as a trajectory for your final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll speak about intersectionality, but from a different angle, about just some current, I think just the current context that that the sex workers that we work with are working and living in. So we have, you know, the impacts of COVID, you know, just so much economic pressure right now with the rising cost of living, and even, you know, the impacts of the Ukrainian war. I just want to mention that for a moment, and what that's going to mean for international migration. So just in the past week, for example, we've had our first request for service from a woman from the war impacted area. So I think, you know, with life getting harder for everyone, I think it just speaks to the need to be able to have better policies, better practices, better legislation in the country to be able to support some of the most marginalized folks in our society.
And I think that we talk a lot about the issue and problem faced by the sex worker and massage parlor worker, right? But actually for many community members in our report we have shared, and also in our community meeting, welcome to join our meeting, that very important message is we really see how the community really sees sex work and working in massage parlor is a powerful resistance of many kind of oppression because of the race, you know, language barrier, particularly the migrant. If you have like facing the language barrier, that is very different, and also those requirement of Canadian experience, you know, like that, like the racist thing. And then many of them is being excluded in like the job market. They are being forced to work in the very low pay and exploitative working condition. This is the way how we maintain the like like the people who in the bottom to support, you know, this. And many workers, they find that work in massage parlor, they have more flexible hours, they can take care of themselves. So, and then they have better working condition. And so, but those things is not being heard, right? And also some people, they have maybe in a very abusive relationship. Instead of just stay in the abusive relationship, they can work in sex industry, they can have better income, they can pay for the lawyer, like, or access more information. And also some workers said that why they like to work in sex industry or massage parlor, actually they can have more connection with the society, because the isolation is the one thing they need to protect themselves, right? But on the other hand, is compared with work in the restaurant, like at the back, or work in a factory, they feel that they are more connected with the society in the way. And many of them, they also see that they are contribute to the society. And I think that is, as when we take away a lot of assumption, we can know about more different kind of story, and then how they are affected by the race, by the immigration background, but also how they resist, right? And I think this is powerful and important thing. And then what thing we need to change, that they can have more power, right? So that's why many migrant organizations in Toronto, they advocate for access with the via policy. This is very important policy. Then the people, no matter the access service or like they report to the police, they don't worry that immigration status will be the easy. Of course, they don't enforce it well, but I mean, this is something, right? So same as the criminal law, we see this is the way to stop the people from helping each other. We have a member being charged of criminal law is by answering the phone for other person, but then actually she referred the old client to her friend that they know they are safe, and she can help to communicate, to discuss what kind of service, and then actually make other people be more safe, right? And also she can use her experts for helping other people, but then is being criminalized. And again, they are being forced to work in like those like oppressive situation, right? So, and I think this is very important kind of story also we need to heard, and we need to share about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, all of these amazing thoughts. They really put things into perspective, and you're absolutely right. This is a conversation that needs to be had, because not many people have them, and not many people really understand what is going on and how these laws are not protecting sex workers, even though they claim to be. So Alison, Elene, thank you so much for coming. And I thank Mona again, even though she's not here. And I also thank Rory and Ev for having provided me with support. So it's been wonderful to have you. And I am so thrilled that you accepted my invitation to come speak.